Over the weekend, as you may have heard, our government set a new record. It wasn't for the number of roads being built or repaired in this country. It wasn't for higher math scores or graduation rates for kids in the United States of America. It wasn't for passing the most bills or investing the most dollars in our future. It wasn't for paying attention to the next generation of Americans. It was for the longest shutdown in the history of the United States. A selfish act taken by partisan politicians that it is an embarrassment to our country and to our future. It's been 24 days. We have federal employees all over the state of Colorado, and I'm sure the state of Alaska, the state of the Commonwealth of Virginia, we heard before, who are out of work because of what Washington has done to them. It is nothing that they have done. They have fulfilled their end of the bargain. But because we have a screw loose around here, because we are the only modern industrialized country in the world who shuts its government down for politics. Our allies don't shut their government down for politics, and our foes don't shut their government down for politics. No local government shuts its government down for politics. No school district shuts its government down for politics. No state would ever think of doing it. No elected official at any level of those governments would show their face in the grocery store on the weekend after they shut the government down and said sorry to the citizens of Alamosa, or sorry to the citizens of Durango, or sorry to the parents in Denver public schools, your kids can't come to school today because we're shutting the government down for politics. It is ridiculous. I met a air traffic controller today, Mr. President, who got her check on Friday after she worked through the entire holiday. She had a kid in her arm. I don't know how old he was, but a baby that had to be carried. She worked the entire holiday, separate from her family. Got her check on Friday. It was for 77 cents. The people of this body might as well be standing outside lifting their middle finger at her. And at the TSA workers who were there today at Denver International Airport, making sure that we were safe, that the traveling public was safe and not getting paid, unlike the people here during this shutdown. By the way, that airport, which we're very proud of in Denver and in Colorado, Denver International Airport, that is the newest airport that has been built in the United States of America, and it was built almost a quarter of a century ago. Because we're not making the investments that anybody else in the world is making. And as I said, Mr. President, no other advanced country in the world shuts its government down for politics. I expect us to have disagreements. We should have disagreements. But we shouldn't shut the government down over this disagreements. 24 days. While we were shut down, other countries were actually investing in their future. South Korea, in the last 24 days, Mr. President, broke ground on an expanded bullet train outside their capital of Seoul. Canada, while we were shut down, announced support for a new 5-megawatt geothermal plant, the first of its kind in that country. India issued tenders to set up 7.5 gigawatts of new solar capacity. New Zealand announced millions in new resources to improve the safety of rural highways. You should see our rural highways. And it's not just this shutdown, it's a decade of fiscal fights made in the name of fiscal responsibility that have put us in the first position since the Vietnam War and before the Vietnam War to see our unemployment rate falling and the deficit going up. This same wrecking crew who called Barack Obama a socialist and a Bolshevik and was incapable of bringing themselves to help at a moment when our unemployment rate was at 10%. And we were at the depths of the worst recession since the Great Depression, have now closed the government. And given us $1.5 million, $2 trillion deficit. While the unemployment rate is falling. And every one of them promised their constituents and my constituents that these tax cuts would pay for themselves. God knows when they added up what this shutdown is going to cost the American people. It's not saving the money. Vietnam opened a new international airport near Ha Long Bay to attract tourists and boost the economy. Singapore is preparing an underground master plan to maximize its urban space by moving things like data centers, utilities, and water reservoirs below ground. A new report showed that for the first time ever, Germany drew more energy from renewable sources than coal in 2018. Ireland, in contrast to what I was just saying about the United States of America, ended the year with a budget surplus. Mr. President, imagine the flexibility it gives legislators and policymakers there to think about, what are we going to do with this surplus? How are we going to invest in the next generation? How are we going to shore up their equivalent of Social Security? Maybe we can have a real middle-class tax cut or lift some people out of poverty in our country. We can't ask those questions today because of our fiscal imbalance and because the government of the United States is shut down. While we were shut down, other countries moved forward with a trade partnership that excludes the United States. Once it's fully in place, it will represent a trading bloc of nearly 500 million consumers that our manufacturers should be selling to, that our small businesses should be exporting to. Not surprisingly, Mr. President, China has been extremely busy over the last 24 days while we have been shut down. While we have been shut down, Mr. President, China landed a spacecraft on the dark side of the moon. That has never happened before in human history. There was a time in our history, you'll remember it, Mr. President, when the Russians launched Sputnik, that caught our imagination. And John F. Kennedy said, we are going to put a man on the moon within the decade. That's what he said. That's what we did, Mr. President. Now, because of the fecklessness of this Congress, did you know that America cannot send an astronaut into space without asking the Russians for permission to ride on one of their rockets? A whole generation of Americans that I was part of, Mr. President, was inspired by the space mission that NASA led. Unfortunately, in my case, it did not lead me to understand anything about mathematics or about science, but it inspired us as Americans to have a big vision for what our country could do. and for what our country could do in competition with our adversaries around the world. Do you think the Chinese are not observing what we're doing while they're putting a rocket, a spaceship, on the dark side of the moon for the first time in human history? Something they will always be able to claim? Something we will never be able to claim? Do you think the Russians know that we can't put somebody up on the space station if we want to? That we have to wait for them to let us do it? Just after they put that spaceship on the other side of the moon, China announced that it's planning another mission to the moon by the end of the year and a mission to Mars by early as 2020. It announced that it's planning to invest in 4,200 miles of new railway lines this year, including almost 2,000 miles of high-speed rail. You know how many more that is than we have? 2,000. And that says nothing about the investments that they've already made. It began operating new high-speed rail lines in East China and Northern China with initial speeds of 155 miles per hour while our government is closed. That's another plan, or that's another set of tracks. China announced plans for a 6-gigawatt wind farm on the border with Mongolia, which, once completed, would become the largest in the world. China continues its pursuit of a vast space-based communications network that will cover every inch of the earth. If we're not careful, they're going to deploy 5G a lot more quickly than we will. That's what the rest of the world is doing while we are shut down. And Mr. President, my view of this is that we don't need to wait for the president on this. That's what the majority leader keeps saying. Mr. President keeps saying, well, I can't pass something that the president will veto because it won't become law. I don't understand the logic of that, speaking of math. We passed a bill in this Senate, this Republican-controlled Senate, I think it was unanimously, to keep the government open. And the House of Representatives, so my math isn't that great, virtually unanimously, the House of Representatives passed a very similar bill to keep the government open. And in the middle of all this, in the midst of all this, President Trump said, I'm not going to accept that because I'm going to use this moment to extort Congress for $5 billion for my wall. He said to the people he refers to as Chuck and Nancy, he said, give me the $5 billion. And they said, well, why don't you just open the government? Because almost a unanimous Senate has passed it, and the House has passed it. And his answer was, because I'll lose leverage, meaning I won't have the misery that I am creating for the federal workforce. I won't have people who can't pay their mortgage, who can't pay for their early childhood education, who can't pay for their education. I won't have their misery to use to extort the members of Congress into giving me $5 billion for my wall. Notwithstanding the fact that he promised over and over and over again when he was running for president that Mexico would pay for the wall. That's not my talking point. That's not me coming out here and being unfair and trying to exploit a weakness or a misstatement. I think it's fair to say almost all of his campaign was based on the idea that there was going to be a wall and that Mexico was going to pay for the wall. He could not have been clearer about that. And now he's trying to shut the government down because he knows Mexico won't pay for the wall, which the rest of us knew the whole time he was telling America untruths about it. And he's turned instead to the American taxpayer to say, okay, I wasn't telling the truth about it then, but don't pay any attention to that. You now have to pay for the wall. And our first response to that is no. You haven't even spent the money that's been appropriated for the wall to date. He has not built an inch of the wall. Look it up. And the second problem is that anybody who has studied this question for any moments of time knows that his proposal is a waste of money for the United States. I'm not going to be lectured by anybody on the other side about the need for border security. I was part of the Gang of Eight that negotiated the immigration bill in 2013. That was a bill, Mr. President, that had not $5 billion of border security in it, not $2.3 billion of border security in it, but $46 billion of border security. It got 68 votes here in the Senate. Never went to the House, never was allowed to have a vote because of the tyranny of the so-called Hastert rule, which requires people not to vote their conscience, but to vote only along party and partisan lines. Another disgraceful chapter in modern American political history. But that $46 billion in that bill doubled the number of border security agents at our border. It built 350 miles of what the president now refers to as steel slats, as if he's invented that idea. It made sure that we could see every single inch of our border. The Chinese are going to be able to see every single inch of the world. The least we can do is see every inch of our border. In that bill, we were able to do that. And meanwhile, he tells his base, and the people on Fox News repeat it every single night, that Democrats are for open borders. Democrats are for terrorists pouring in over the southern border. Mr. President, I have become convinced, and I'm going to stop because my great colleague from New Hampshire is here. I have become convinced, having spent years working on immigration, years working on border security, years working with my most cherished Republican colleagues on this issue in a bipartisan way, that the president doesn't want the wall. He wants the entertainment of the wall. He wants to rally his base around the wall. And meanwhile, he has taken the leading economy in the world, a country with the largest capacity for self-defense in human history, and he has shut its government down over a $5 billion phony wall. And it is a disgrace. It's a disgrace for every hard-working federal worker and their families who depend on them, who are out of work, who are being furloughed, who aren't being paid. It's a disgrace for every person who works at state and local government and in school districts all across this nation who would never think about shutting their government down for history, but who understand that what they possess as a civil servant is a sacred trust to their community and to the next generation of Coloradans or of folks from New Hampshire or of Americans or of Alaskans. And we can't wait for the president. And I'll finish with this. Because he either doesn't want the wall or he doesn't have the capacity to get to a solution to it. And so we have to do our work as senators. And we have to vote to reopen the government. And if that were put on the floor tomorrow, it would pass. And I'll bet you it would pass with a veto-proof majority. Why? Because everybody's constituents in this place would say, are you out of your mind? Don't come back here and have another town hall and explain why you shut the government down over politics. Instead, Democrats and Republicans should come together in this chamber and set an example for the American people and say, all is not lost. This exercise in a democratic republic is going to live to fight another day. We've come to our senses. We're not going to beat our own constituents to death for the purpose of empty partisan slogans or ideas that aren't going to advance the interests of the next generation of Americans. I worry every night that I'm here, Mr. President, about how the next generation of Americans, what kind of history they're going to write about what we did when it was our responsibility to make sure that we fulfilled our commitments to them. The same ones that generation after generation of Americans have fulfilled for people who came after them. That's what it means to be a citizen in a republic like ours. And we are violating every norm of that approach to the work and allowing our competitors around the world to create advantage for themselves and potential liabilities for us. We shouldn't let this thing go into the 25th day or the 26th day or the 27th day. We should end it now. Mr. President, I yield the floor.